Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be my April wrap up. Now for the month of April, it's odd to say I had a terrible and fantastic reading month. Basically for the first 2 weeks of the month, I read basically nothing. And this was predominantly because I was traveling, which was a blast. I have no regrets. But when I got home, I feel like for the 2 weeks I had left for the month, my completion of 5 books is honestly pretty solid. Like if I kept that pace for the whole month, I would have had 10 books. You get what I'm saying? That being said though, for the 5 books I read, I feel like there's a pretty good variety here, some really solid fantasy and then some fantastic literary fiction. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first book I was able to complete for the month is Dreamer's Pool by Juliette Marillier. This is the first book to the Blackthorn and Grimm series by this author. I knew I really wanted to read some Juliette Marillier for this spring because I just feel like her style and her environments that she creates in her books just really feels like so nature forward and lush and spring-like. I also was really curious to check out a new series. I hadn't read of hers before. Obviously, I love The Daughter of the Forest and I need to read the 3rd book in that series. What can I say? I love starting new series without completing old ones. It's a bad habit I have that I will probably never stop doing. That being said, in this series, we're introduced to our main character, Blackthorn, and at the very beginning of this book, she has been captured and wrongly imprisoned by like her arch nemesis in this truly awful environment. And before I go any further, I do want to say trigger warnings for a variety of different types of assaults. Juliette Marillier's books, while beautiful and lush and full of great characters, tend to also lean on the darker side in terms of the themes and the trauma that a lot of her characters have to confront and overcome. But at the beginning of this book, Blackthorn is imprisoned and she's a healer, and she's basically offered an opportunity of freedom from kind of a mysterious magical figure, but she has to agree to his deal. And that is she has to move to this very remote cottage on the edge of a settlement and kingdom, and there she has to live for 7 years and basically say yes to anyone who needs help. She can't accept payment. She also cannot pursue revenge. Blackthorn, having lived in such a terrible situation and condition, doesn't want to give up revenge that is rightfully needing to happen, but obviously realizing that her life is on the line, she decides to accept this deal. We follow her as she travels through the wilderness with kind of a sidekick-esque character, another individual who was imprisoned in the place where she was. When she arrives there, she also meets a young prince who basically seeks out her counsel because his newly betrothed seemingly is very, very different than the letters that she had previously sent, despite the fact that she looks the same, but there's just things that are slightly off about her, and he is very concerned. And so begins kind of a book about healing, a book about conspiracy, and very much is written in a fairy tale style that is true to Juliette Marillier, a style I personally really enjoy. I wouldn't say I loved this book as much as The Daughter of the Forest, and while at times the plot was a little bit straightforward, I still really enjoyed the themes, especially surrounding Blackthorn. So much of this book was like about healing, literally, physically, about healing oneself and being involved in community once again, kind of allowing yourself to have happiness, to be loved by others, and not just in a romantic fashion. There's so many different characters you see that go through incredibly harrowing situations and through like the embracive community are able to find possibly a second chance at life. I would say this book does sometimes fully deliver in what I wanted it to, and then sometimes kind of came up a little short. I do appreciate that Juliette Marillier kind of leans into the darker strangeness aspect that a lot of fairy tales tend to have. Like the stories told around fire aren't necessarily always completely logical or like fully fleshed out, and because of that I do feel like this really fits the spirit of that. I liked it. I wouldn't say I loved it. I will definitely check out other books in this series, and I would give this book like a 3.5, 3.75 out of 5 stars. From there, I picked up Age of Legend by Michael J. Sullivan. This is the 4th book to the Legends of the First Empire series, which obviously is a series I've not been able to shut up about since I started it late last year. I've been flying through it, and this 4th book was no exception. I was really curious about this particular 4th book because structurally how this 6-book fantasy series is supposedly written. It's kind of written in like 2 parts. There's the first trilogy and the second trilogy, so I wasn't sure if there was going to be a time skip. I wasn't sure if we're going to be following the same characters, yada yada yada. You get the idea. This 4th book is definitely a setup book for the rest of the series. That does not mean I found it boring or uninteresting in any type of way at all. If you're not familiar, the Legends of the First Empire series is kind of a fantasy series set in an ancient past. We follow a variety of characters, but it's kind of like an elf, dwarf, human sort of setup. Throughout the entire series, you see the evolution of human society through inventions and the testing out of different political structures. It's a super cool ad, and I really feel like adds so much to the world building itself. Something else I really enjoy with this series is you follow a plethora of point of views, and really unexpected point of views at that. Particularly in this fourth installment, we had a main character I truly would have never expected when I ran into them earlier in the series. Michael J. Sullivan really artfully combines some books having like these massive political like conflicts and other books having these really wonderful quests. So it kind of has all of my favorite elements of fantasy, just depending on which book you pick up. The escalation of the plot and world I thought was progressed in a really logical fashion. There was actually a decent time skip going into book 4, allowing our characters to kind of grow in different directions and kind of mature in their viewpoints, and also just allowed things to develop and marinate in a way that I also really enjoyed. I really liked book 4. I really cannot wait to pick up book 5. The cliffhanger at the end of this book was quite something. I loved the setting. I loved the escalation of the conflict, this idea of a stalemate and like what happens when no one is really progressing, but people are still dying on both sides. It's just so good. I've truly become obsessed with Michael J. Sullivan this year, and I'm gonna read all of his books. That's what I've decided. But yes, I loved this book. I would give it like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. Not my favorite in the series, but definitely one I still really enjoyed. The next book I picked up is a very hype, like newer release I've seen circling around online, generating quite a bit of buzz. And it was also the Cozy Club Book Club pick for our spring season, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. I found this book to be delightful. It was charming, it was cute, and it was honestly the perfect book I needed to kind of get me back into the swing of things when it came to reading. It was just easy, breezy, but also very, very interesting too. But this book is kind of a fantasy-esque romance, and a lot of people actually compare it to Howl's Moving Castle, which I would say from a plot point of view, not so similar, but from a character dynamic point of view, particularly with our two main characters, very comparable. Like, the main male love interest definitely gives Hal vibes, and the dynamic between the two main characters is totally Hal and Sophie, if you know what I mean. But this story is set kind of in the early 1900s, and we follow our main character, Emily Wilde, and she is described as like a curmudgeonly professor, and she is particularly interested in the field of studying fairies. She has spent her entire career traveling all around the world, collecting stories and gaining knowledge because she's working specifically on building an encyclopedia of all of this information. At the beginning of this book, she is entered a new location, kind of hopefully her last location, as she is just trying to gather the few remaining stories she wants to include for her big research piece. But unfortunately though, she is struggling to not only get the information, but she kind of starts out on the wrong foot with a lot of the villagers, as she sometimes struggles in social situations. More annoyingly, her academic rival, which is very much a one-sided rivalry, arrives on her doorstep as well. And his name is Wendell. And Wendell is charismatic, he's over the top, he's dramatic, he loves beautiful things, and they kind of begin to team up and begin to not only help the town with some of their fairy issues, but also begin to investigate some of the stories that Emily was initially curious about for her encyclopedia. Obviously, some other things begin to play out. There's romance, there's adventure, the whole works, if you know what I mean. And honestly, as I mentioned, I really loved this story. It's definitely cozy, it's not gonna blow your mind, and I also feel like going into this book with the right expectations will really set your mood in terms of how you'll experience it. But honestly, the thing I was most surprised by was not even the romance or anything like that, which I will say was paced really well, but actually how intricate the fairy plotline of this book was. You could clearly tell that Heather Fawcett loves fae and folklore stories, and I felt like the inclusion of so many different stories and how the fae fantasy world worked within this novel was like really well plotted. I'm not gonna lie, oftentimes when I go into like a romance fantasy story, I assume that the fantasy component will kind of fall by the wayside as the romance plot progresses, but that was not the case in this book at all. All of the different fae elements were well thought out, really, really interesting, and honestly added a bit of a darker air to this book, and overall I just enjoyed it so much. I also really appreciated that Emily Wilde never lost her passion or her reason for being in this place to begin with. For the same reasons I mentioned before, sometimes I feel like the initial point of what brings two people together again fall to the wayside as the romance becomes center stage. But Emily Wilde's character stayed true to herself throughout the entire story. Loved their dynamic, I loved their banter, and I was really charmed by the fantasy world that the author created, and I'm very interested in reading book 2. It was cozy and just delightful, as I keep saying over and over again. I was charmed by this, and I would give it like a 4 stars. It wasn't perfect, but I really, really enjoyed it. And then lastly, I read 2 literary fiction novels that both blew me out of the water entirely. The first is When We Were Birds by Anyanya Lloyd Banwo, and this book was beautiful. Like, there's no other word to describe this book but than just stunning, and just a stunning work of like characters and love and fate, and just everything about it was truly just an experience from page 1. This book centers our 2 main characters. The first is Yehide, and she's grown up kind of on the outskirts of town in this family home, and she has always had a very complicated relationship with her mother, who's been kind of distant her entire life, but also she has felt the burden of the family expectation to take on various legacies as well. First, there's the family business, which she's never felt wholly prepared to take over. And then lastly, there's this murky expectation of some type of magical thing that happens within the household. And that is one member of the family always helps shepherd the dead into the afterlife. But at the beginning of the story, Yehide's mother is dying. And after feeling years of bitterness and neglect from her mother, she doesn't feel prepared in any way, shape, or form to again take on this family legacy. And she's looking for a way out. We also follow our other main character, Darwin. Darwin was raised in a very small household with just him and his mother has very strong religious beliefs. And one of those specific beliefs is that the living should never interact with the dead because it would make them unclean and unfit to move on into the afterlife. However, though, at the beginning of the story, his mother, who has been a long-time seamstress, is struggling with her health, and Darwin obviously wants to take on work for himself to be able to provide for both of them. Unfortunately, though, the only job he's able to find is that of working within a graveyard, which obviously causes a lot of strain between their 2 relationships. This story is about 2 young people kind of on the precipice of huge change in their lives in general, kind of moving from adolescence into adulthood. This book is also set in Trinidad, and the setting is so paramount to just everything about this story. The environment that the author is able to create, the setting, you feel immediately transported to the time and place that these characters are living in. Obviously, death is a huge thematic element tied throughout this entire story, and the fateful meeting of these 2 characters is just like beautiful to see. I just loved the writing style. I loved the characters. Picking this book up, I also thought we'd be rotating points of view, but instead it's actually more so you're reading a huge kind of chunk from Darwin's point of view, kind of getting settled in his perspective, his life, his reflections, and then moving on to Yehide, and then you see their slow meeting of coming together. Honestly, I just loved every single second of the story, from the writing, which was just lush, to the setting, to the characters. It was an absolute win for me, and I would give it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. I highly recommend picking this book up. Then the last book I read for the month of April was wild. Like, there is no other way to describe this book than just absolutely bananas, and it was also fantastic. And that is Burnham Wood by Eleanor Canton. And it's honestly hard to even begin to describe this book, but if I had to kind of give you an elevator pitch, this is like multi-POV literary fiction meets thriller. It's absolutely unhinged. The overall concept of the story is, first, we are introduced to a guerrilla agriculture leftist group. They're communist. They have this very strong manifesto of basically taking over unused, neglected spaces, even if they're private, and basically planting agriculture and basically providing like radical access, freshly grown food, which is a really cool idea, if I'm being honest. This book takes place in New Zealand, and the leader of this agricultural group named Burnham Wood, at the beginning of this book, basically discovers that after a landslide that happened in kind of a remote area of the country, left kind of a large tract of land inaccessible, which could be a huge opportunity for Burnham Wood to plant a lot of food and a lot of crops. So she, at the beginning of this book, travels out there to get more information and discover if it will be possible. When she's there, though, she runs into a very unexpected figure, and that is a very eccentric American billionaire who's looking at the same property to build his like doomsday shelter. They strike up conversation. They also strike up a deal, and that is this American billionaire wants to invest in Burnham Wood, which obviously goes against most of their principles, but would also give them an opportunity to expand the program to unbelievable new heights. That is only like the setup of the story. The way that this book completely spirals out of control and completely falls off the rails is unhinged. I could not put this book down. It has so many fantastic things going for it. First and foremost, there are no chapters. It's just one long internal monologue after another, jumping from all of these characters. We're living inside of their heads. We're living inside of their deepest passions, their deepest political viewpoints. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're annoyingly right, sometimes they're way off base. A lot of times they're way off base, depending on who you're reading from. And it's such this interesting place to be because you're surrounded by all of these passionate people. And I was joking with a friend who's also reading this book that oftentimes you feel this dissonance because for many of them, morally very, very good, but also morally terrible because a lot of them are not good people at all. More than that, as this billionaire gets more and more involved and the characters that are in Burnham Wood begin to struggle more with each other, things are just truly next level in this particular story. Obsessed with this. Like, it was a work of character study, but it was also, again, like a thriller and a drama and a mystery all at once. And in this combination, Eleanor Canton created a book that I was not able to stop reading. It was compulsive, and I just want to talk to everyone about this book. Luckily for me, it's actually my IRL book club choice, which I feel like this is a perfect book club book. There's so many things you could dissect, talk about. I don't know, I feel like it could spur so many different types of discussions, which I'm looking forward to. And if you're looking for a book club book, this is a great one for that. But I loved it. And I honestly would give this book like 5 out of 5 stars. It was such a ride. Alright guys, those are all the books I read for the month of April. Please comment down below some books you've read recently, as I would love to know. And I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye.